You know, in the world of heavy-duty diesel engines, there are some that are just legends. Power plants so reliable, so iconic, they basically define an entire era. But here's the thing about legends. Even they have to step aside eventually. So let's dive into the story of how one of the greatest engines ever built was kind of forced into retirement and the really complex successor that had to take its place. This right here is the story of the Cummins ISX.
For years, if you talked to truckers, this was what they'd say about the Cummins N14. The high horsepower versions even got a nickname, the Red Top. And man, it was a beast. It was powerful, it was simple, and it was unbelievably reliable. For a long, long time, it was the undisputed king of the road.
But for all its muscle, the N14 had this one critical vulnerability. See, there was this unstoppable force coming, something that no amount of horsepower or sheer toughness could ever overcome. And it was about to change the entire diesel industry forever.
So what was this unstoppable force? Well, it was government regulation. Specifically, the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, started a massive clampdown on diesel emissions. They were targeting pollutants like nitrogen oxides, or NOx, and particulate matter, which is, basically soot.
So why couldn't the mighty N14 keep up? Well, its whole architecture was based on the old 855 Big Cam series from back in the 1970s. It was a brilliant design for its time, don't get me wrong, but it was never, ever meant to handle the kind of complex emission systems that were about to become mandatory. It was like trying to run modern software on a computer from the 70s. It just wasn't going to happen. It was an analog engine in a new digital world.
Just look at this timeline. It really shows the pressure cooker that engine makers were in. These regulations weren't just a one-time thing. Oh no, it was a relentless series of stricter and stricter rules. First, a big change in '98. Then, boom, EGR systems become mandatory in 2002. 5 years later, you need a DPF. And then, by 2010, the standards demanded a whole new layer of technology. The goalposts just kept moving, faster and faster.
Cummins saw the writing on the wall. They knew they couldn't just keep putting Band-Aids on the N14. They had to start over, from scratch. And their answer was a completely new engine, a clean slate design that they called the ISX. Now this is really crucial. The ISX wasn't just built to scrape by the 2002 rules. It was actually designed as this adaptable platform, engineered from day one with the full expectation that things like particulate filters and other systems were going to be added later on. It was an incredibly forward-thinking design meant to last for decades.
And that different design philosophy led to a very different engine. The ISX was bigger, a full 15 liters versus the N14's 14. But look at the geometry here. It had a smaller bore, but a much longer stroke, which, by the way, was absolutely key for getting that massive low-end torque. And instead of the N14's older, separate modular heads, the ISX used a modern, much stronger one-piece cylinder head. I mean, the checklist for the ISX engineering team must have been huge. First, it had to be cleaner than any engine Cummins had ever built. It had to go head-to-head with absolute legends from Detroit Diesel and Caterpillar. And, most importantly, it had to uphold that sacred Cummins reputation for million-mile durability, all while trying to be more fuel-efficient. Yeah, no small task.
And it did. The story of the ISX over the next decade is really one of constant evolution, with more and more layers of complex technology being bolted on to meet each new wave of regulations.
Okay, so the first piece of this emissions puzzle was EGR, or exhaust gas recirculation. Here's how it works. The system takes a little bit of the exhaust gas, cools it down, and then feeds it right back into the engine's intake. This actually lowers the temperature inside the cylinder when the fuel ignites, which dramatically, and I mean dramatically, reduces how many of those nasty NOx pollutants get created in the first place. All right, next up for the 2007 rules, we got the DPF, or diesel particulate filter. The easiest way to think about this is like a super sophisticated soot trap sitting in the exhaust pipe. It physically catches all that black smoke, cleaning up the exhaust right before it leaves the stack.
Then came the final, and definitely the most complex piece of the system in 2010, SCR, Selective Catalytic Reduction. This system actually sprays diesel exhaust fluid, or DEF, into the hot exhaust. A wild chemical reaction then happens that converts the last little bit of harmful NOx into simple, totally harmless nitrogen and water. Pretty clever, right? So let's put it all together real quick.
The engine burns fuel, which creates exhaust with both soot and NOx. Right away, the EGR system kicks in and lowers the amount of NOx being formed. Then, that exhaust travels down to the DPF, which acts like a net and traps all the soot. Finally, the SCR system scrubs out whatever NOx is left. It's an incredibly complex dance, but it's also incredibly effective.
But all of this new complexity, it came at a price. The transition from the super simple N14 to the high-tech ISX was, well, it wasn't exactly smooth. In fact, the early years were filled with some really expensive growing pains.
One of the most infamous issues on those early dual-cam ISX engines was wiped-out camshafts. We're talking lobes literally getting flattened, which caused all sorts of terrible performance problems. A mechanic would replace the cam, and then a little while later, it would happen all over again. So what in the world was going on?
And this right here perfectly illustrates the engine's new complexity. The problem wasn't actually the camshaft at all. The real culprit was a bad batch of rocker arms that weren't letting oil flow the way they were supposed to. They're basically starving the top of the engine for lubrication, causing all those metal parts to just hammer themselves to death. If you didn't know to replace the rockers, you would never, ever fix the problem.
And boy, the list went on. That whole EGR system, with its valves and coolers, was a constant source of trouble, either getting clogged up with soot or spring-in coolant leaks. Later models had these high-pressure fuel pumps with ceramic plungers that could literally just disintegrate, sending little bits of shrapnel through the entire fuel system. A total nightmare. And the complex variable geometry turbos? Yeah, they had their share of failures too. For a while there, the ISX definitely earned a bit of a reputation in the repair shop.
But that is not the end of the story. Not even close. Because despite that really rocky start, the ISX platform was fundamentally solid. Over time, Cummins worked out the bugs, and the engine's true purpose was finally realized.
And the proof is right there in its longevity. The ISX in its various forms has been in production for over 2 decades now. And listen, you just don't survive that long in the heavy-duty truck market unless you are, at your core, a tough, capable, and efficient engine.
Ultimately, the ISX succeeded where others just couldn't. Those same emissions regulations that killed the N14, they also drove Caterpillar completely out of the on-highway engine business. But Cummins, with its adaptable ISX platform, they weathered the storm. And they came out on the other side, dominating the market. And what about that legendary durability we talked about? Well, the ISX proved it was a worthy successor. Well-maintained engines regularly hit that magic million-mile mark before needing a major overhaul. It successfully picked up the torch from the N14 and truly became the new workhorse of the American highway. So the ISX was born from a crisis, and it evolved to survive. Its story is really the story of an entire industry grappling with a whole new set of rules. Which, it leaves us with one final thought. As regulations continue to tighten, pushing us all toward a zero-emissions future, what's the next great leap in engine technology going to look like? And what legendary engine of today is about to meet its own unstoppable force?